How is it possible that someone with money, status, and every opportunity in the world could still be seen as a failure? This is the case of Michael Thompson, cruelly nicknamed the useless heir, a 19-year-old who seemed to have everything, yet carried the emptiness of never achieving anything on his own. Until one unexpected voice changed the course of his life, not that of a renowned teacher, nor a powerful businessman, but the housemaid's. This is a story of painful falls, intense confrontations, and a transformation no one believed was possible. If you want to discover how a young man written off by everyone found the strength to build his own legacy, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know just how far this story is reaching. Michael Thompson, at 19, faced yet another rejection from the university entrance exam. With every failed attempt, the media reinforced his cruel nickname, the useless heir. Behind the branded clothes and careless posture hid an insecure young man, suffocated by the expectation of living up to his father's legacy. The weight of failure, magnified under constant public scrutiny, became unbearable. Inside the mansion, tension filled the air. Richard, his father, used his influence to silence scandals, fearing the family's image would be stained. Elizabeth, his mother, could no longer endure the veiled criticism at social dinners, each insinuating her parenting had failed. Within the luxurious walls, the sensation of dishonor grew, as though wealth was not enough to erase the shame. Michael lived a paradox. He had everything, yet felt nothing truly belonged to him. It was as if his life were a stage illuminated only to expose his flaws. The privilege surrounding him became a golden prison, where every mistake was judged with even harsher severity. There was no room for anonymity, only for cruel headlines that highlighted his helplessness. Irony was his favorite mask. When called incapable, he answered with mockery. When accused of laziness, he showed indifference. This arrogant stance was only a disguise to hide his shame. With each forced laugh, the young man tried to cover the fear of not being able to prove his worth. Richard saw in his son a problem money could not solve. Accustomed to turning crises into profitable deals, he did not know how to handle Michael's fragility. Elizabeth, rigid and protective, reacted with severity, believing constant pressure could forge discipline. Yet the more they demanded, the more he withdrew. His failures became a public spectacle. Newspapers displayed his face as an example of wasted opportunities. Public opinion turned him into a target, and every setback was amplified as if it were definitive. The young man felt trapped, with no room to try again without being ridiculed. At the heart of the mansion, silence grew heavy. The grandeur of wealth clashed with the smallness of hope. Michael saw no future, only barriers rising around him. The label of useless heir seemed already engraved into his identity, and any attempt to erase it appeared futile against the collective judgment. And yet, something lay hidden even from Michael's understanding. Within every fall, there was an invisible seed. Repeated failure was not only destruction, but also a silent invitation to change, though he had not yet discovered it. He could not see it, but destiny was already preparing an unexpected turn. And just when darkness seemed to dominate every corner, an unlikely voice would rise, ready to transform not only Michael's path, but the very essence of the Thompson family. The Thompson mansion's kitchen was wide, modern, filled with marble and stainless steel. But that night it had become a stage for outburst and fury. Michael stormed in like a hurricane, shouting that he was a failure, kicking a chair as he crossed the room. His voice echoed against the cold walls as if trying to break free from a weight too heavy to carry. The silence of the house shattered under a cry of pain and revolt. Angela Williams, the maid, stopped what she was doing. A black woman, dignified and firm, dressed in her green uniform with her hair tied back in a simple bun. Her gaze carried the strength of experience of a life marked by struggle. Without hesitation, she let slip a phrase loaded with truth. "You're not stupid. You just don't know the value of struggle. And without struggle, you will never win." Michael spun around suddenly, his eyes blazing with mockery. He laughed bitterly and snapped back with arrogance. "Shut up. You're just the maid." The words cut through the air like a blade. Each one was dripping with venom, a reflection of his wounded pride and inability to accept the vulnerability she had exposed. The impact was immediate. Angela stood firm, though her eyes shimmered for a moment, containing a mix of pain and courage. It was clear she had not spoken out of defiance, but out of care. Even so, Michael's reaction placed her in danger. In a house where status defined power, her words had crossed a dangerous line. Just then, Elizabeth entered the kitchen. Always elegant, wearing a designer dress, her expression was stern. Her voice rang out with authority and restrained fury. "Angela, never speak to my son like that again. If you dare interfere once more, you will be out of this house." The sentence struck like a hammer, leaving no doubt about who dictated the rules there. Michael, moments earlier so furious, fell silent at the scene. His mother's defense brought him no comfort. Instead, it reminded him of his dependence. Angela, meanwhile, stood tall, refusing to bow her head, though the threat of losing her job pressed on her chest like an iron weight. The tension in the air was palpable. Among the gleaming appliances and the lingering scent of spices, an invisible battle was being waged. On one side, the arrogance of a young man broken inside. On the other, the courage of a woman who dared to say what no one else would. Elizabeth stood as the embodiment of rigid order, upholding the untouchable hierarchy. In that moment, the kitchen, usually a space of routine and quiet, had turned into a battlefield of worlds. Angela represented raw truth, Michael the reflection of suffocating privilege, and Elizabeth the personification of social power that refused to admit cracks. A simple dialogue had exposed wounds deep enough to shake not only the family, but the fragile balance of the household itself. Angela returned to her work with her head lowered, though not completely defeated. Michael stood still for a few seconds as if digesting what he had just heard. Elizabeth, firm and unyielding, left the room, carrying with her the tension of the ultimatum she had spoken. And so the seeds of silent change began to take root in the heart of the one least willing to listen. Angela returned to her work in silence. Her steps were steady, yet the weight of recent humiliation made her posture slower. She did not lower her head, though the threat of unemployment loomed over her like a shadow. The kitchen, now spotless and organized, still carried the echo of the confrontation. Every corner seemed to remind her that speaking the truth could come at a heavy price. Michael, meanwhile, didn't miss the chance to ridicule her. He threw sarcastic remarks as he passed by, as if he needed to reaffirm his power. Arrogance was his armor, the mask that concealed his shaken core. Yet the more he mocked, the more he tried to silence the uncomfortable memory of her words. Deep down, he could not push Angela's voice away. Alone in his room, surrounded by luxury and a privileged view of the city, Michael faced his own reflection. The mirror showed the image of an arrogant young man, but his eyes betrayed his insecurity. Angela's phrase, "Without struggle you will never win," returned like a persistent whisper. For the first time, someone had told him something even his parents dared not say. His pride, however, was stronger than his willingness to change. Every time Angela's words resurfaced, his mind reacted with denial. He tried to convince himself it was nonsense coming from a mere employee. Yet when he lay down at night, the silence brought her sentence back, as if it were a mark impossible to erase. Angela continued her duties with dignity. She swept the corridors, cleaned the furniture, and carried out each task without showing weakness. To an outsider, nothing seemed different. But in every quick glance Michael cast at her, there was a sign something was stirring inside him. His disdain could not mask the growing unease. The young man felt wounded yet did not know where to aim the pain. Part of him wanted to despise Angela for challenging him. Another, quieter part recognized the truth in her words. This duality tormented him, for accepting it meant admitting he had always lived without effort, sheltered by his family's fortune. Deep inside, Michael fought an invisible battle. Pride against conscience, mockery against truth. It was as though two versions of himself wrestled for the same identity: the useless heir proclaimed by the media, and a young man who might become more. This struggle remained hidden from the world, but grew stronger within him each day. Elizabeth and Richard noticed nothing of this silent war. To them, life seemed unchanged: elegant dinners, social engagements, the same routines. But their son quietly was beginning to shift, even if against his will. His wounded pride paradoxically planted the first seed of reflection, and while Angela carried on firmly, and Michael tried to escape his own turmoil, a subtle change had already begun. Small, discreet, but undeniable. Something in Michael had been altered since that phrase, and sooner or later he would be forced to face the voice that refused to stop echoing within him. Michael began to wander through the kitchen almost every day. Pretending indifference, he leaned against the doorframe as if he were merely passing by. In truth, his disguised gaze and attentive ears sought something he would not admit even to himself: Angela's words. There was something in her voice that slipped into his silence. Angela, unaware of the young man's hidden presence, told stories as she worked. She spoke of nights spent without sleep, studying by candlelight while raising her children. Her words were filled with simplicity and truth, while her hands moved between pans and brooms. Each gesture turned the kitchen into a place of wisdom. Michael never dared to reply. He only watched in secret, as if he were stealing experiences. He wrote in hidden notebooks, recording phrases, details, even small metaphors Angela used. It became a secret ritual, a silent confession that his arrogance was slowly giving way to curiosity. Angela's stories spoke of struggle and perseverance. She described waking before sunrise, the effort to keep her children in school, the bills that barely balanced at the end of the month. Each account was a brutal contrast to the life of luxury in which Michael was immersed. And no matter how he tried, he could not ignore those differences. With every new story, Michael was confronted by a reality he had never known. Angela's simple words carried more strength than any motivational lecture or paternal advice. It was as if each sentence were a key, unlocking doors within him he hadn't realized existed. What seemed like mere domestic routine became true learning. Late at night, in his room, Michael opened the hidden notebooks and reread his notes. Suddenly, the useless heir became a secret student. The phrases he copied echoed like silent reminders, each one serving as an anchor for thoughts he had never entertained before. Pride still lingered, but it now shared space with something new: unspoken admiration. Angela remained unaware of the impact her words carried. To her, they were simply fragments of memory slipping out while she worked. Yet unknowingly, she had planted seeds in fertile ground. Michael, who once ridiculed her, now found in her stories an invisible map leading him beyond arrogance. The silence between them became a bond. He pretended not to listen, and she pretended not to notice his presence, though her posture betrayed otherwise. It was a quiet dance. She taught without meaning to teach, and he learned without admitting he was learning. The kitchen had become a place of invisible meetings, of lessons without a declared teacher. And so, day after day, that secret habit began to take root. Michael still carried pride, but he could not deny that something was changing inside him. It was as if each of Angela's words were bricks, silently building a new foundation, a foundation that soon enough would be tested in far greater ways. The tension that had been building could no longer remain hidden. That afternoon, Angela, already familiar with the heavy silences of the mansion, dared to confront Michael once again. While cleaning the kitchen counter, she let sharp words slip. "You have everything and don't know how to use any of it. I would give my life for a chance like yours." The air seemed to freeze. Michael reacted like fire meeting gunpowder. His face flushed, his eyes blazed, and his voice burst out with fury. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" he shouted, knocking a glass over the counter. The sound of shattering glass echoed like a warning that the situation had crossed the line. Angela did not retreat. Her posture remained firm, even in the face of the young man's overflowing anger. Her eyes carried the courage of someone with nothing left to lose. Her words, though simple, struck like precise blows. Truths Michael tried desperately to avoid, yet could no longer ignore. Elizabeth entered once more, drawn by the uproar. Her expression was filled with indignation and intolerance. Seeing Angela standing before her son, she lashed out harshly. "One more time and you're fired." The threat cut through the air violently, leaving an uncomfortable silence. The weight of her words fell heavily upon everyone present. The mansion's atmosphere became unbearable. Amidst the shining luxury and the aroma of freshly prepared dishes, a sense of silent war lingered. Angela, with dignity, returned to her duties, though her movements betrayed the weight of the threat. Michael, on the other hand, tried to mask his unease with shouts and mockery. Yet inside, something was shifting. Later that night, secluded in his room, Michael sat before his hidden notebooks. Angela's phrases echoed like an unwanted mantra. He flipped through the pages, trying to study, but impatience overtook him. Complaints, scribbles, crumpled sheets. Still, a part of him resisted giving up. Her voice would not leave him in peace. It was as if each of Angela's words had imprinted themselves in his mind. "I would give my life for a chance like yours." That sentence in particular reverberated with force. Michael, who had always viewed his privileges as something natural, began to realize there were people who would give everything for what he squandered. That realization cut deeper than any insult. His pride still fought against reflection. He tried to convince himself it was nothing more than the whim of an insolent maid. But every time he attempted to study, his mind returned to the stories he had overheard, to the truths he could not erase. It was as if two invisible forces pulled him in opposite directions. That night, the mansion seemed even more silent than usual. Michael, with tired eyes and hands pressed against his notebooks, breathed deeply. The fear of failing again still haunted him. But for the first time, there was also a spark of determination, a spark born unknowingly from the fire ignited by Angela's words. In the silent room, Michael stared at his notebooks as if facing an invisible enemy. The stack of scribbled pages seemed to mock his failed efforts. He tried to solve exercises, but the pen trembled in his hands. With every mistake, the instinct was to throw everything away, to repeat the cycle of giving up. Frustration became his constant companion, yet something different kept him at the desk. Angela's words echoed within him. One step at a time. Consistency, not perfection. That phrase returned like a persistent whisper whenever he thought of abandoning the books. For the first time, Michael was trying not out of fear of his parents nor the pressure of the media, but because he wanted to prove himself capable. The hours passed slowly. Between scribbles, right answers, and many mistakes, Michael began to experience what it meant to deal with his own patience. Complaints slipped from his mouth with each difficulty, but he no longer dropped the pen as quickly as before. There was resistance in his movements, as if an invisible thread kept him anchored to the chair. Each small achievement became a relief. Solving a simple question felt to him like a monumental victory. The arrogance he had always carried began to make room for a timid recognition of effort. It was fragile, but it was real. For the first time, it wasn't about appearances, but about experience. Angela had no idea of the effect she had caused. As she went about her daily routine, she could never imagine her words were serving as a guide for her employer's son. Michael, in silence, repeated her advice in his mind. Pride still kept him from thanking her, but inside something new was blooming. Discipline. Time seemed to move at two rhythms, slow during difficulties, fast in small victories. Michael realized he didn't need to conquer everything at once. He was learning to divide tasks, to take one step before the next. This simple concept, so obvious to many, was a revelation to someone used to wanting results without effort. The mansion, once the stage for outbursts and shouts, began to take on new sounds. The scratching of the pen on paper, the turning of pages, the heavy breathing between frustrated attempts. His bedroom shifted from a place of disorder into a space of silent battle, where Michael fought against his own tendency to give up. And even in defeat, there was progress. Each failure no longer ended in abandonment, but in another attempt. The young man who had once been defined by failure now discovered that consistency mattered more than perfection. This transformation was still small, but it already distanced him from the label of useless heir the world had given him. That night, exhausted, Michael rested his head on the notebooks. There were no certainties, but there was a beginning. And among crumpled pages and poorly solved equations, a new habit was being born. The first step had been taken, and each new attempt would show that his struggle was only just beginning. The following days brought a subtle yet decisive change. Michael no longer hid his presence in the kitchen. Instead of peeking from the doorway, he now entered openly, seeking contact he didn't dare admit he needed. Silence was slowly replaced by timid words, almost whispered. Angela, surprised, noticed his approach. At first, she kept her answers brief, testing whether his interest was genuine or just another act of mockery. But soon she realized there was sincerity in the young man's eyes. The arrogance of before seemed to give way to a strange curiosity, tinged with respect. Michael began asking questions, not about cleaning or housework, but about effort, discipline, patience. He wanted to understand how someone managed to keep going despite so many difficulties. Each answer from Angela was received with almost childlike attention. Between pots and notebooks, an unlikely dialogue began to emerge. Angela spoke while stirring recipes, sweeping the floor, arranging utensils. Her lessons came in the rhythm of daily tasks without the tone of a sermon. Michael, sitting in a corner, scribbled discreet notes in his notebooks. The kitchen turned into an improvised classroom, where wisdom was wrapped in the sounds of cooking. The young man who once mocked her now showed silent gratitude. He no longer laughed at Angela's stories, but asked her to tell more. The tone of their conversations revealed growing respect, as if every word she spoke was a compass helping him to reorder his own thoughts. What once seemed impossible was now becoming real. Angela, in turn, discovered someone willing to listen. For years, her voice had gone unnoticed, confined within the kitchen walls. Now it found an echo in the heart of a young man everyone thought was lost. That recognition breathed new life into her stories, which flowed with even more clarity and strength. Richard and Elizabeth, unaware of the depth of this bond, only saw the household routine continue as usual. They had no idea that in that seemingly ordinary space, something transformative was taking place. Without realizing it, Michael had found in Angela what he had always needed, someone unafraid to tell him the truth. Day by day, the relationship took shape. It was no longer just a young man listening to stories, but a learner seeking guidance. Angela, without formally assuming the role, became his mentor. She needed no titles to teach. Her life itself was the greatest testimony. Michael absorbed it with the thirst of someone who had finally found a source. And so, among the smell of home-cooked meals, the clatter of pots and the sound of pages being filled, a fragile trust was born. A bond that had not been planned, yet proved stronger than any formal agreement. It was the beginning of something greater, an education that would soon be impossible to ignore. Mornings in the mansion were no longer the same. Michael, once lazy and always late, now woke up early, often before breakfast was even served. His hurried footsteps echoed through the halls, and the staff watched with surprise at this once apathetic young man, who now seemed determined. The routine itself began to reflect the change. Richard noticed the difference. The son who used to hide away in his room now spent hours studying alone. Surrounded by papers, books, and notebooks, there was a new light in his eyes, different from his usual arrogance. For a man used to measuring everything in results, that unexpected dedication was a shock. Elizabeth, though more resistant, also perceived it. Her rigid expression softened little by little as she saw Michael speaking calmly, without shouting, without his former outbursts. She still doubted it, as if it were just a passing phase, but deep down, she began to realize that something real was happening. Angela, quietly, was the invisible root of this change. With every piece of advice in the kitchen, every word spoken without pretense, she planted seeds that were now beginning to bloom. She sought no recognition, merely carried out her routine. And yet her influence was evident in Michael's gestures and in his new way of looking at the world. Richard, in a rare moment of vulnerability, approached Angela. His voice, once heavy with authority, came out trembling. "You gave my son what money cannot buy." It was more than gratitude. It was admiration. The magnate discovered that power and wealth were not enough to shape character. Angela received his words with humility. There was no wide smile or exultation, only a firm gaze filled with dignity. It was as if she said without speaking that she had done nothing more than what she believed was right, to speak the truth, even when it came at a cost. Elizabeth watched in silence. For the first time, she did not react with hostility to Angela's presence. The memories of their recent confrontations weighed on her. The elegant, rigid woman was beginning to question her own attitudes, as if an invisible mirror forced her to reflect on herself. The atmosphere in the house had changed. It was no longer just a place of luxury and appearances. It had become the stage of real transformation. The staff whispered about the new Michael, and the parents, still confused, began to accept that this change had not come from within the family, but from someone who had always been there, unnoticed. And so the mansion that had once witnessed failures and clashes now sheltered a process of rebirth. Michael was no longer the same, and everyone around him could feel it. But the path was still being built, and the next challenge would reveal whether this change was strong enough to withstand the weight of expectations. The big day had arrived. Michael woke before sunrise, his heart pounding like a drum. The city was only just awakening, yet inside him anticipation was already surging. He put on a simple shirt, unlike his usual choices, and carelessly brushed back his messy hair. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about appearance, but about purpose. In the car on the way to the exam, the streets seemed to pass by like scenes in a film. Every stoplight, every pedestrian, every noise of the city was filtered through a single thought: the test. The silence during the ride was absolute. Not even Elizabeth, usually controlling, dared to speak. The tension was shared. When he arrived at the test site, Michael took a deep breath. The place was crowded, hallways full of anxious students clutching books to their chests, whispering nervously. He felt small but not powerless. Inside him, simple phrases echoed like mantras. Breathe. Think. Try again. The exam room was cold, lit by white fluorescent lights that emphasized the impersonality of the moment. Rows of desks, the scratching of pens, the ticking of clocks, everything created a tense atmosphere. Michael sat down, adjusted his papers, and closed his eyes for a brief moment, searching for focus. Angela was not physically there, but her voice seemed to pass through the walls. Each question answered was accompanied by an invisible echo. Calm. Breathe. You can do it. He realized he was not battling the test, but his own fears. For the first time, he felt prepared to face something with serenity. The hours crawled by. Michael scribbled, reviewed, doubled back. Mistakes no longer paralyzed him as before. On the contrary, they became part of the process. He remembered the sleepless nights, the crumpled pages, the small silent victories. Each struggle he had faced now served as a tool to keep going. Outside, Richard and Elizabeth waited in silence. The magnate, used to numbers and results, now felt the weight of waiting. Elizabeth, restless, tried to hide her anxiety by fidgeting with her discreet jewelry. For the first time, the parents weren't thinking about reputation or appearances, but about their son's real effort. With each passing hour, the burden grew lighter. Sitting at his desk, Michael no longer saw himself as the useless heir. He felt like an ordinary young man fighting alongside everyone else. And that thought paradoxically gave him strength. Privilege was no longer his shield. Discipline had become his true weapon. When the final bell rang, Michael set down his pen slowly, breathing deeply. His heart still raced, but it carried something new: serenity. There was no guarantee of success, but there was the certainty that he had faced for the first time a real battle. And that in itself was already victory. The results were finally released. Michael walked through the university corridors, surrounded by anxious students crowding around the bulletin boards. His racing heart made each step feel endless. The voices around him seemed distant until his eyes found the name written there. His approval was clear as daylight. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Michael raised his hand to his mouth, his eyes brimming with tears, unable to believe what he was seeing. The useless heir, the cruel title he had carried for years, was now replaced by another identity, that of someone who had won. Not because of family money, but through his own struggle. Without thinking, he rushed outside, pushing through the crowd. The noise of his classmates celebrating mixed with the sound of his hurried footsteps. Angela, who had gone to work as on any other day, was suddenly faced with the scene. Michael, in tears, running toward her. The encounter felt less like a plan and more like an explosion of emotion. He embraced her tightly in front of everyone. The words came out between sobs. "You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." The gesture disarmed the crowd. The students who once mocked him now stood in silence. Phones were raised, recording the scene that would soon spread far beyond those walls. Angela stood firm, but she couldn't hold back her tears. Her simple uniform contrasted with the embrace of a young man dressed in branded clothes. But in that moment, the social differences vanished. There were only two people bound by a truth. Michael's victory was also hers. On campus, the scene went viral within hours. Social media filled with videos and comments. The useless heir had transformed into a symbol of resilience, and Angela, once invisible, was now recognized as a central part of the story. The truth of that moment could no longer be hidden. Richard, upon seeing the footage, felt his chest tighten. The son who had so often disappointed him now stood tall before the world. It was no longer the Thompson name that carried this victory, but the courage of a young man who had learned to fight. This time, pride lay not in wealth, but in character. Elizabeth, in silence, replayed the recording over and over. Every detail, Michael's tears, the embrace with Angela, the reactions of the students, dismantled the rigid image she had held for so long. For the first time, she saw her son not as a failure, but as a man in transformation. And so, in that simple and genuine gesture, victory went far beyond the exam. Michael had not only earned a place at the university, but also the right to write his own story. A story recognized not for titles or inheritance, but for effort and truth. The Thompson mansion was quiet on that special night. Unlike the usual luxurious parties, the atmosphere was intimate, filled with anticipation. Angela, the guest of honor, walked with hesitant steps through the grand hall. The shine of the chandeliers reflected in her tearful eyes as the family waited to reveal the surprise. Richard was the first to speak. Wearing his impeccable suit but with a trembling voice, he called Angela to the center of the room. His words were simple yet powerful. "Nothing we have compares to what you did for our son." The magnate, so used to contracts and deals, now spoke only as a grateful father. Angela, still dressed in her green uniform, didn't know how to react. She was used to serving, never to being celebrated. Her steps felt heavy, as if she feared that all of this might be a dream. But the family was there, gathered, ready to acknowledge the value of someone who had always been invisible. Elizabeth approached slowly. The rigid face of before now showed vulnerability. With restrained tears, she extended a golden envelope and said, "You weren't just part of the house. You were always part of the family." It was a gesture of redemption, an apology embedded in every word. Angela opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, the keys to a new house. It wasn't just a material gift, but a symbol of a new place in the world. For the first time, someone was saying out loud that she deserved more than just to survive. The entire hall fell silent. Michael, moved, approached and embraced her in front of his parents. It wasn't the desperate hug from the day of the acceptance, but a mature gesture, filled with respect and love. He whispered softly, "Now everyone knows who you've always been to me." Angela's tears finally fell, not from pain or exhaustion, but from recognition. Years of effort, struggle, and sacrifice were now acknowledged. Her dignity, so often ignored, was celebrated in front of everyone. She was no longer the invisible employee, but a pillar of the Thompson family. Richard, overcome with emotion, held his wife's hand. For the first time, Elizabeth didn't hide her vulnerability. Her sincere apology marked the end of a barrier that had kept Angela at a distance for so long. What once was hierarchy had now become gratitude and respect. In that hall filled with memories, no luxury could surpass the value of that gesture. The new house was more than walls and doors. It was the recognition of a life dedicated to truth. Angela, in tears, embraced them all, forever marking the night when she ceased to be invisible. Michael walked across the university campus with steady steps. The classmates who once mocked him now greeted him with respect. He no longer carried the weight of the cruel nickname. In its place was a new identity, that of someone who had built his own story. The useless heir was left behind. In the classroom, he sat at his desk like anyone else. There were no privileges there, only effort. The professors noticed his dedication, and even the suspicious looks from classmates began to fade. For the first time, Michael understood the value of standing on equal ground with everyone. Meanwhile, Angela was living a new chapter. In her new house, simple but full of meaning, she often received visits from the Thompson family. The green maid's uniform was still part of her routine, but now she was seen differently, as someone who had changed the destiny of an entire family. Richard, always busy with business, made time to be present during those visits. He knew that true inheritance did not lie in numbers or contracts, but in the example Angela had left behind. His more human posture reflected the transformation of a man who had learned to value the unseen. Elizabeth, silently, showed her change in small gestures. The rigid gaze had given way to empathy. Sitting in Angela's new living room, she understood that true elegance did not come from jewels or dresses, but from the ability to recognize human worth above all else. Michael, whenever he could, returned to the mansion's kitchen, now empty. Without Angela's daily presence, the space held memories. On the table, the old notebook of scribbles remained as a symbol of his rebirth. He smiled, touching the worn pages, remembering the voice that had once echoed there. The phrase that followed him most, like an invisible compass, was clear. Life is not about what you inherit. It's about what you build. These words guided his days, not as a reminder of weakness, but as a promise of strength. He knew the future would only make sense if it was earned. Angela, even in her simplicity, had become a living legend within that family. Not for the material gift she had received, but for the invisible impact she left behind. She was proof that the power of a life is not measured in wealth but in legacy. Her story was now forever intertwined with the Thompsons, and so in one final silence inside the mansion, Michael closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The past of failures had become his foundation. The present was victory and the future a promise. In that moment, he understood that every heir must choose to carry only the weight of the surname or to build something that remains. Michael's journey showed that no cruel nickname is strong enough to define a destiny. What once seemed to be the path of a useless heir transformed into a living example of resilience. But none of this would have happened without Angela, the invisible woman who, with simple and honest words, forever changed the course of that family. And it's impossible not to ask, how many times in your life have you faced your own entrance exam? How many moments when everything seemed lost, but a voice, from a friend, a mentor, or even someone unexpected, showed you there was still hope? This story doesn't end here. What awaits Michael in the future? What will Angela's life look like in her new home? And how far will this bond between them go? A bond born out of pain, strengthened through discipline, and blossomed into gratitude. If you're curious too, write here in the comments, do you want part 2 of this story? I want to know how far you'd like to see this transformation continue. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because that's the only way you'll follow not only the continuation of this tale, but also many other stories that might change the way you see your own life.